Good evening and welcome to Conversations Live, the impact of the budget impasse. I'm Patty Satalia. What a difference a day makes. Just yesterday, Governor Tom Wolf announced that he'd allow a budget closure package to pass, but without his signature, saying he still thinks the budget is unsound. The impasse lasted 266 days. Tonight, our experts will discuss what caused this historic standoff, its impact on schools and nonprofits, and what it means for future budget negotiations. They'll also take your questions. Now let's meet our guests. Robert Strauss is a professor of economics and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University. He has extensive public service experience in the areas of federal, state, and local finance, as well as state and local tax policy. Rick Roush is the dean of the College of Agricultural Sciences at Penn State, which, now that the budget has passed, prevents the need for drastic personnel and program cuts. And joining us by telephone is Madonna, director of the Center for Politics and Public Affairs. He's also a professor of public affairs and director of the Franklin and Marshall College Poll. Thank you all so much for joining us. You can also join tonight's conversation. Our toll-free number is 1-800-543-8242, and our email address is connect@wpsu.org. You may also tweet your question or comment using the hashtag WPSU Conversations. So let's get started. My guess is that almost everyone knows by now that the governor announced yesterday that he will allow the GOP's $6.6 billion budget closure package to pass, although grudgingly saying that the numbers really don't add up. So I'll begin with you, Professor Strauss. What's your reaction? What was your reaction to the news?
Well, as a voter, a citizen, and a taxpayer, I think it was long overdue. I think nobody won in the process. This is a training of a governor by a legislature that's of the opposite party. And don't forget that there were two-thirds votes standing there in the House and Senate were he to have vetoed. So he really had to fold his cards and take what was given to him. In
fact, you've said he folded his cards too late.
I have said that. I've said that around the country when asked. I think he used up too much political capital. I think he made his point that he disagrees on policy. The question now that arises is, what about 16-17? What I hear is that the members want to get it done by July 1st, and they want to go run for re-election.
On the due date. Oh, yes, so, right, and it's an election year.
This is an election year. The structural problems in our budget are very substantial, and pensions were not touched. So we've got a lot of things on our policy plate as citizens and the elected officials that represent us. And I'm sure they're going to hear about it when they go campaign, because a lot of people, even though there's been relative quiet, are unhappy about this taking as long as it has. And around the country, we've been put in the same category as Illinois, and that's not a good thing.
Which still hasn't passed a budget.
That's right. They're the last one.
We're the only state that we've beat to the finalizing a budget. Dr. Strauss, what does Roush, what was your reaction to this?
We were immensely relieved. As Bob said, though, there were no winners in this. We ended up suffering quite a lot of loss to the college in terms of our reputation, our ability to fill positions and so forth. But we're immensely grateful to our very passionate supporters, thousands of them who backed us across the state. 4-H members, people from the agricultural industry, especially the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau, our master gardeners, literally thousands of people. There was very strong support from county governments with whom we were
County commissioners wrote pointed letters to the governor.
They were very supportive as well, and at a time when they had their own struggles to deal with as well. So we were immensely it was heartwarming to see so many people turn up. On the 9th of March, we had 500 or 600 people. A large number of them, 4-H members, came to the Capitol to demonstrate their support for us. So it was extremely gratifying. We're forever in their debt.
All right. Dr. Madonna, what was your reaction to the news?
Well, the governor had come under increasing pressure, not just from school districts and county commissioners for human services and nonprofits that were about to undergo some very severe problems and a lot more pain than they even were going through before the budget was adopted by the legislature, and the governor line itemed about $7 billion of it. He met last week with Democrats in caucus, and I think he got a mouthful.
An earful.
Yeah. No, they were giving him the mouthful, arguing that it needed to end at least temporarily. It didn't take the minority leader in the House, Frank Dermody, but 5 minutes to issue a statement in support of what the governor did. And basically, he's not given up his argument that there's a $1.8 to $2 billion structural deficit. He's not given up on the Marcellus Shale tax, the severance tax as it's called. He's not given up on some of his priorities. He has allowed this budget to become law without his signature, in effect saying the Republicans in the legislature are responsible for any shortcomings, any problems that develop over the course of the next several years. But I think he probably had no choice given the reactions that existed in the Capitol. Now, in the polls that I've done on this, the voters support education spending increase, support the shale tax. However, having said that, in the poll that I released today, there's no support for general tax hikes, meaning sales tax or income tax hikes. They favor these niche taxes. The bottom line is they want compromise. The voters don't want the services cut, but they're not willing to buy into an income tax hike or a sales tax hike, and that's what has impartially led to the problem.
Interestingly, you have done a number of polls, I think 2, where you asked voters, who do you blame for this budget impasse? And overwhelmingly, it was the legislators, not the governor.
Well, the governor has the bully pulpit. He gets around the state. An individual lawmaker may represent 60,000 people in the House and 250,000 or so in the Senate. But remember, the governor was elected by 10 points on an agenda. Now,
and that
some
was
say,
education
it's a
spending.
reaction to Corbett, and Corbett was unpopular, and the voters are really just saying we want a new governor. But the governor was elected to do education spending increase, to do property tax reform, to do a shale tax. The voters support that. But the fact of the matter is that the legislature is elected from a different constituency. In the same election in which the governor won by 10 points, the Republicans won 119 seats in the House. Add one that they picked up in a special election early in 2015. That's the largest majority in the State House of Representatives since Eisenhower was president.
There's a disconnect there that's really interesting. And, House Speaker Mike Terza of Sewickley wasted no time saying that Wolf's actions yesterday showed, quote, a tacit admission that the Republican approach to the budget is the fiscally responsible approach. And so I want to ask you, we've got Wolf saying that you are just adding to a $290 million problem, $2 billion problem with $280 million, making it $280 million bigger. Who's telling the truth here?
Well, from my ivory tower, but also tempered by my own experience watching drama, shenanigans, however you want to characterize it, each of the sides, the legislature and the governor, have principled arguments, and as Terry said, they both got elected, and the Republican control of the legislature was stronger. But I want to go back to the point that a lot of Democrats were willing to move with Terzai, and there was the votes were there in the Senate. So people wanted to end this of both political parties. It's commonplace for voters to want their cake and eat it. They want more services. They would like somehow the shale tax or somebody else to pay. But in the reality of a slow-growing economy and a very much graying population, our ends are not meeting. And as I've tried to tell people in Harrisburg privately, the worst is yet to come. And that has to do with the fact that we're going to add 1 million retirees by 2025 to our population and take 1 million out of the labor force. And retirees do not pay any taxes
on the retirement income.
So just let me give you a number. It's a paper I gave at Lehigh a couple of years ago. If we tax retirement income as we tax regular income, we would have had $2.5 billion more this year in revenues, which would have more than closed the structural deficit. And as we get older to 2025, there's maybe $6 or $7 billion of foregone retirement income taxes paid. And the other thing is, as we get older, we just demand more health services. So this disparity, and I know that I told legislators this privately, and they don't want to face up to it, the disparity of the trajectory of our spending and our revenues is getting farther apart.
And this is on top of a pension problem,
which was not dealt with at all. That's correct.
And in fact, Democrats were moving away from Governor Wolf and his attempts to work on that.
That's right, because in the final analysis, the problems that we're facing are getting larger because they were not addressed when we could afford to address them. And I'm afraid that they've overwhelmed the political process. And so even if the budget is passed by July 1st for 16-17, we're not going to be out of the problem areas that I've described because the economy is going to slow down. And the Pennsylvania economy is not growing as fast as other parts of the country.
And we're already the third oldest state
I've got some gray hair.
in the country.
You've got some gray hair. You may have some gray hair. I don't know. That's right. So there's a lot of things that need to be faced up to. And I view these problems as potentially advantageous for politicians to talk about so they can say they're solving problems.
Except that this is, as you said earlier, one of you said earlier, this is an election year.
Correct.
And we know what happened to Governor Raymond Schaap when he started talking about raising taxes. You know, why can't Pennsylvanians, our elected officials, face the facts that taxes may be absolutely necessary?
Yeah. May I jump?
Sure, please do.
Here's the situation. If you go back and you look at enormous fiscal problems the state has faced, let's talk about it, when they needed to raise revenues from what we could call a general tax hike. 2003, 1991,
right.
1983, and 1977, the way that they did that was to raise the income tax. They may have fooled around with niche taxes here and there in off years. They have never raised a big tax, a general tax, in an election year. And since the enactment of the first permanent income tax in 1971, during Milton Schaap, the legislature passed a progressive income tax. The Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. Right. In August of 1971, they passed the first permanent income tax. It's not progressive, it's flat. No general tax hike to raise large amounts of revenue because of fiscal situations, usually caused by a downturn in the economy. There is no reason to believe, with lawmakers up for re-election, that they're likely to do anything with a general tax hike. They might do niche taxes, even in the House.
When you say niche, do you mean, for instance, Governor Wolf would like a $1 a pack hike on cigarettes?
That's right. And
okay.
By the way, tobacco products taxes are very popular. We're one of two states, I think, that don't tax cigars and smokeless tobacco.
Right.
All the buddies of mine who play golf are really opposed to that.
But there's not a lot of money in those.
Okay,
yeah,
there's not a lot of money in those. Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the bottom line here is, and this needs to, I think, what makes this different is we have the most polarized legislature because we have the most polarized electorate in modern history. Democrats are more ideologically liberal. Republicans are more ideologically conservative. The pragmatists are gone for the most part.
And they're retiring, too, Derek.
Yeah, that's right. They're retiring. And I want to make one other point. Wolf and the Republicans in the Senate, and the Republicans in the Senate tend to be a bit more pragmatic, passed a framework budget that increased the budget by a little more than $1 billion, agreed to pension reform with employees who earn more than $50,000 a year. Once they get there, they were going to do a 401k style plan. They would stay in a defined benefit plan. They agreed on a certain amount of privatization of the retail sales for alcohol. That passed the Senate. Governor Wolf supported it. Both sides, agreed, and it was jettisoned by Speaker Terzai
Right,
and a
and
much more conservative House among the Republicans than in the Senate. There was a deal worked out that, you know, had some fiscal sense to it, about $1 billion more in spending. They were going to use exemptions, removing exemptions from the sales tax
right,
on things like, you know, unfortunately, you know, funeral costs, cable costs,
right,
tourist
cable
industry.
TV. They want a 6% sales. He wanted a 6% sales tax on cable TV.
Yeah, and there was a whole allotment. Now, none of that was made, quote, public. All of that drifted out of the meetings between the governor and Senate leaders. They also considered raising the state income tax from 3.07 to 3.3. So there were talks between the governor and the Senate that might have produced something, but the House is far more conservative, led by a conservative speaker. And the majority leader of the state House from Indiana, Dave Reed, was part of the deal in the Senate, which the House majority overruled.
But let me just say, what you're saying does not bode well for future negotiations. And in fact, when we're talking about blame here for this, you said part of the blame goes to partisan voters.
Goes to us.
So
it goes to us.
Yeah, it goes to us. So, you know, to me, the irony of all of this is that back in December, Wolf described the GOP-written budget plan as, quote, garbage, and it looks like he basically got maybe even a little bit less than what was on the table in December.
Oh, yeah, about $500 million less. I think it's something like $3.25 billion. He got much less, about $500 million. He did get about $200 million for the schools, but the framework had it about $400 million. So he actually got less now by not approving the original, well, not the original, the last House-Senate Republican budget that passed. He lost about $500 million in this.
And Dr. Strauss, you wanted to add to that?
Well, so this is all what I describe as training the governor. Rendell had his own treatment, something like this. But what I'd like to tell the viewers is that the notion that Pennsylvania has a $30 billion budget is just way too low. If you add up all of the off-agency spending every year, you're at about $80 billion. You take the various commissions and authorities that money goes into and out of, the lottery, the Turnpike Commission, federal money that comes through. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors in the coverage over the decades about, well, we've got a 25, now we've got a 30 billion. But the budget, when you do the consolidated accounting, is really in the high 70s or low 80s and kind of fluctuates from year to year. And the long run, I think, is caught up with us. And that's why I worry that the political process that Terry describes, and, you know, I've heard about, sort of the inside baseball, is not in the right quadrant, because we're getting much older. We've got the Affordable Care Act expenses to deal with. We expanded Medicaid. There are all these big pressures. And the governor has annoyed not only the Republican leadership in these meetings, but he's annoyed
even his
own minority leadership. Let me go back to what happened a couple weeks ago. The story I heard was that when the governor talked to the caucus, the House Democrats, after the vote in the House to get rid of the blue line stuff, there were 80-plus people in the room, and when he said, "I want you to stand with me because I'm going to veto this," 40 of them got up and walked out of the room. I've never heard about that. That, to me, is political history. And the other political history to remember is that when a tax increase was bandied about, the House voted unanimously against a tax increase. It was like 193 to 0.
So I want to take a phone call in just 1 second, but in your view, do we need a tax increase in Pennsylvania?
We have to raise taxes intelligently. And my view is, especially because of this elderly mismatch, that we could tax 5% of retirement income at 3.07%. That would bring in a couple $100 million. So you'd have a 95% exclusion, and then next year 90, and bring it down to 50%. So it'd be kind of like Social Security. Because remember, at one point in time, the governor said, well, he doesn't want elderly to pay property taxes. And if they're not going to pay property taxes and they're not going to pay taxes on their retirement income, who's going to pay for public services in the Commonwealth? And it's going to be just working people.
And how are we going to keep young people in Pennsylvania if they feel the burden of
2 years
this older
ago,
population?
when I gave my talk that showed this disparity, people in the audience said there are people from New Jersey and New York coming to retire in Pennsylvania because
there's no tax on their
well,
retirement
and they're going to
income.
get public services to boot.
Oh.
They're getting both sides of the equation. So we have to, as a civil community, I think, face up to this, and it ain't going to be easy.
All right. Let's go to Rhonda, who's on the line from State College. Go ahead, please, Rhonda.
I'm not sure if this is the right time for this question, but I read that school districts across the state borrowed more than $900 million to get through this impasse. $900 million. I mean, how much is the interest on that, and where is that money coming from?
Dr. Madonna, is that something you can address?
Well, I thought
the
when
interest?
the Auditor General, Eugene D. Pasquale, did that, the caller may be right. The last number I saw was more like about $450 million. I'm not suggesting that's low by any stretch. There was proposals kicked around that the state would pay the interest for the money that has been borrowed. And I didn't see anything in this budget.
How could the state pay that interest?
Well, legally they could. They can just give the school districts the money to pay for the interest that they had to pay on the money that they borrowed. I mean, legally the state can do it, but I don't think there's any plan, and maybe some of your other guests can comment on this, but there's nothing in the legislation that I've read about or heard about that indicates they've done that. I think the school districts are on the hook for the borrowing, just as some of the nonprofits and counties.
I think I agree with that, Terry.
You know, one of the things you said, Dr. Roush, is, if this budget impasse hadn't ended and we had gotten to, I think you said May 1st. May 1st, you would have been furloughing people.
We would have been laying people, giving them layoff notices effective into June. That's right.
Yeah,
1,100.
So how did you stay afloat through that, and what does it mean for the university?
The university's got some reserves, and it was able to sort of cover us under those reserves. But at the same time, I'm going to talk about the so-called non-preferred in a moment, but basically, if the state didn't come through eventually, and there was no real evidence, for a long time, all the signals we were getting is it might not happen. So the problem the university was faced with is, where do you make up that difference? Because the funding we get it's about $50 million from the state government, about $22 million from the federal government as a match, which we would have had to pay back if we didn't get enough state funds.
In your college?
Just in the college.
Yeah.
But there's no way that goes to fund agricultural extension and agricultural research. There's no way to fund that off tuition. It wouldn't be ethical to even do so, to be able to tell kids from Harrisburg that some of their tuition dollars are supporting agricultural research. So there was no way, other kinds of forms of funding within the university to cover the tuition offsets we get from the non-preferred budget could be made up by other sources, including tuition. But there was no way to backfill the funding for the college, so we'd be out.
Let me just say that the bigger thing, too, is that it's $50 million in an appropriation from the state, but there's all kinds of other grant money that is tied to that. So if you don't get the state's money, you also aren't getting this research grant to do this project or that project. So give us an idea of just how big this was. So our staff are
really good at leveraging from this base of support, bringing back a lot of federal dollars to Pennsylvania. So from the money we get from the state, there's another $22 million that's formula funding that comes back to the state from the federal government. But on that base of the 50 from the state and the 22 from the federal government, in 2014-15, we earned $56 million in federal grant dollars. We are very competitive. Groups in pollination ecology, for example, are extremely competitive, both nationally and internationally. So we were bringing back a lot of cash and funding the rest of the operation. Over the years, we've managed to integrate our teaching, extension, and so forth. We've got people that have extension appointments that are actually teaching classes on campus. But that mix of people that are spread out across all 67 counties that teach, extend essentially adult education, advice about farming, but much, much more than that, including health issues, Marcellus Shale, and so forth. All that was happening out there, but it was also integrated within our teaching. So the students had a very rich experience across a whole range of agricultural and environmental issues. So, well, that was, it's a wonderful thing the way we've had it all linked together for a long time. But when this came along, we sat down to think about, well, how are we going to tear this apart and lay off these people? It was a nightmare.
And you were talking about 1,100 people,
1,100 people.
With the ripple effect, it would have been many, many more than that.
Yeah.
Dr. Strauss, you had something to add.
A couple of points. First of all, Penn State is a large, important institution in the state. And so the couple $100 million that it added up to that was at risk could be covered in the short run by sort of retained earnings. But from a management point of view, on a forward-going basis, there has to be a lot more contingency planning for the potential risk of this happening again and again and again. And so one of the sort of awkward things that's going to happen if rainy day fund gets added up to cover most of an appropriation because it could be very late, is then you're going to be accused as an institution of stockpiling and doing it through tuition. And
right.
My first stage of my career, I was at Chapel Hill, and I heard all about this. Second thing is, talk about CMU and Pitt. We share the support of a supercomputer center. And so that's federal money, but there's state money going into Pitt that's used indirectly. Mm-hmm. And that's part of our intellectual fabric. We collaborate with Penn State. We collaborate with Lehigh. And there's all sorts of indirect relationships that really get put at risk because of the uncertainty in Harrisburg. And that's no way to run an no for-profit corporation that's an $80 billion organization can run that way.
Right, because research projects are going to say
Penn
State's too risky.
That's right.
Smart, bright people are going to say, I don't know if I have a job next year, so I don't know that I want the position at Penn State.
I'll go take a position in Ohio.
Right.
I mean, the other thing is, if you think about it, this is the economic, if there is a source for an economic engine to drive jobs in Pennsylvania, it's that linkage of all those universities.
That's right.
And so the notion that we're going to hold hamstring not just our college with its 50 or 70 million, but hold all of Penn State hostage on $225 million, the collective $600 million among all the non-preferreds, withhold that money and tie up. I mean, we want to be driving at Penn State, and I'm sure at the other universities, we want to drive students to be better entrepreneurs so they can go out and generate companies and jobs in Pennsylvania. And as Bob says, if we're holding back that money for a rainy day, and literally that was happening. President Barron had lots of ideas about things we want to invest in. We couldn't even raise, in our college, we couldn't even raise $500,000 to extend some of the programs we already had.
I want to quickly tell people, if you are just joining us, I'm Patty Satalia, and this is Conversations Live, the impact of the budget impasse on WPSU. Our guests tonight are Robert Strauss, a professor of economics and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University, Rick Roush, dean of the College of Agricultural Sciences at Penn State, and Terry Madonna, director of the Center for Politics and Public Affairs at Franklin and Marshall College. Our telephone number is 1-800-543-8242, and our panel is ready to take your phone calls. If you'd prefer to email us, our address is connect@wpsu.org. And I'm going now to Gene, who is calling us from Altoona. Go ahead, please, Gene.
Yes, good evening. Taxing pensions. Is this everybody's pension, from veterans' pensions to railroad pensions to Social Security and everything else? And how do you tell somebody that maybe gets a pension of $25,000 a year, they're going to have to pay 2 or 3% when they're trying to maintain a home or an apartment and buy food and buy health care and stuff like that? Maybe if we go after the people that don't pay taxes, the state would stop giving out corporate welfare. We have a Delaware loophole that has been in business for years, where corporations from Pennsylvania can go to Delaware, set up little phony storefront shops, and not pay taxes. I read in the Harrisburg paper about 2 years ago, the state is losing about a $500 and some odd million tax return because these corporations are allowed to skip across the border to tax-free zones. Right. So what kind of income level are you going to base your taxes on?
Okay.
And how do you tell some poor widow or widower that they're going to have to pay taxes on something that they hardly can live on now?
Right.
That's my question.
All right. Thank you, Jim.
Okay. Well, first of all, Pennsylvania is one of only 4 states that completely excludes retirement income, number one. Number two, I believe that the current constitutional provisions of differential treatment of poor people and the elderly would allow one to fashion a very generous exemption, say the first $25,000 or $30,000 of earnings, and then phase in the tax rate as we do with the poverty exemption. So
actually, this tax exemption only began in 1971 to begin with.
Right. So there's ways to do it that are fair and treat the elderly fairly. But the conventional wisdom in Harrisburg is that they actually in 91 did that for about 3 months, and then there was a catastrophe. The backlash was serious. But, you know, we're 20-odd years down the pike, and this growth in the elderly, you know, 1 million more retirees, 1 million less working, creates financial problems. And
what about the tax dodgers he mentioned, though?
All right, if we get to the corporate income tax, that's a very complicated issue. I agree that the Delaware holding company planning opportunities are real and that there's real money to be made. But we also have the highest corporate net income tax rate in the state, and that's been a disincentive for expansion and people relocating. So you really have to be careful about what economic engine you want to hurt to make budget.
Okay, and we go now to John, who's calling us from Alexandria. Go ahead, please, John.
Hi, this is John Dawes, and my question is, had we not had a severance tax from 2008 on, would we not have a balanced budget? We're not even as progressive as West Virginia with a 5% severance tax.
All right, but we do have an impact fee, don't forget.
You're talking about Marcellus Shale.
Yeah.
Right, 1.25%.
So, you know, the severance tax is a reasonable idea, but to impose it at this point, when rigs are declining, the activity is declining, and the price of natural gas and oil is depressed,
of course, if they're not pumping natural gas, they're not paying on something that they're not producing.
Well, correct. But the question is, of the industries in the state that have shown some vitality, do you want to impose a tax when they're reducing activity? And I got to tell you, you can't do these things in a vacuum. We're competing with Ohio and West Virginia for Utica, and there's a lot of questions being raised by decision makers in the private sector about the reliability and the sanity of our political process. And that goes not just to the governor not getting what he wanted, but also to the conflict between him and the General Assembly. The absence of compromise has been part of the reason that our debt has been downgraded repeatedly. And I'm not convinced that we're not going to see more downgrading because we really haven't solved our financial problems.
Which means borrowing money for the Pennsylvania government is going to be more expensive.
That's correct.
All right. Well, I don't know if we answered your question, John. Thank you for calling in. We go to Scott, who's calling us from State College. Go ahead, please, Scott.
Hello?
Hi, Scott. What's your question?
Hi. My name is Scott Chambers. This previous caller answered one question I had in reference to the gas tax. The first major question is comment on the process in which this budget was developed. My understanding was that basically there were not bipartisan talks leading up to the development of this budget, which then created further problems. And it goes back to, I think, the point that's been made, the dysfunctional nature of our legislature and political process. But I'd be curious to hear some of their comments about how this budget was developed, pattern that has been in place for a while.
Okay. We'll start with Dr. Strauss and then go to you, Dr. Madonna.
For better or for worse, I know the budget secretary. I've known him for over 30 years. Randy Albright. He's a very bright guy. He was a staff aide in the Senate for a very long time. And I've heard all kinds of stories about how the budget got started and how the negotiations went forward. And there are criticisms of some of the staff around the governor politicizing their discussions, and their accusations, as Terry related earlier, that the House, having made a deal, reneged on it when leadership went back to get the votes. So I think there's plenty of blame. But one of the things that I've heard repeatedly from really both parties and in both bodies is that the governor was not always in control of the details.
You said there was a lack of leadership.
I didn't. Did I use those
You did.
words? Well,
I read that quote.
All right. Well, I said, but not on this show.
No.
All right.
In print.
But that's right.
Okay.
And he's new at the job. It's different than being Secretary of the Revenue, and it's different than running a big private company that's privately held. And the notion of sitting down and having dinner with just the leadership without the staff, the schmoozing, the getting to trust each other, the private understandings, I'm not convinced that took place. In fact, I tried to get some people in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh to try to get some of that stuff going, but it hasn't really happened yet.
Dr. Madonna, what's your take on this?
I think early on there was lots of backslapping and interactions. They had a number of meetings, and the governor did meet with some of the top lawmakers. The problem is really not that they didn't get together in terms of being physically in the same room, although there were a fair number of meetings without the governor and with staff and others, and sometimes one of the leaders would be gone. The real problem is the fundamental differences are so great that they could keep meeting forever. And I've heard the same things about the staff and whether the staff was giving the governor the right advice. But in reality, I think we're dealing with a governor who believes, and I'm not getting to whether it's right or wrong, I'm suggesting the governor believes that if he doesn't get the structural deficit taken care of, new revenues, to do the things that he wants to do, that the state in the long run will be in fiscal chaos. So we can talk about the staff around the governor, and I don't disagree that, there have been some problems there, but the fundamental issue here is the governor's own positions. He said in his first budget message in March of 2015, and I don't think we believed him.
Well, do you believe him?
Here's what he said.
Let me just back up. Do you believe him,
I'm going to be a different kind of governor. You hear what we sort of, okay, lots of governors say things like that, but he meant it. And then he faced a legislature that was very ideologically different. Many of the members took no tax hike pledges when they ran, elected with huge percentages of the vote, many of them without opponents. 120 state house members did not have a general election opponent in 2014.
Well, do you believe, Terry Madonna and then Dr. Strauss, that we do need a tax hike? And as we have a 3% spending increase with this new budget and no tax increase versus what Governor Wolf wanted, which was a 6% increase in spending and this multi-billion-dollar tax increase that would have taken place through a number of different avenues.
Yeah, well, let me just if you go back through history, as I've said, no tax hikes, general tax hikes in election years. But I went back and looked into tax hikes in 91 and 83, and I could find virtually no lawmaker that lost an election because they voted for an income tax hike. The Casey tax hike was brilliant in this respect. They raised the income tax over a 2-year period. The first year was higher. That was the odd-numbered year. And then back when we got to 92, the income tax rate went down. So lawmakers could run saying, I reduced your taxes after they voted the previous year to increase them. It's pretty ingenious in the political sense. The political environment out there is different. But if you raise the income tax, if you're in a family of 4, up to about $33,000, $34,000, you don't pay the tax. A single person, I think it's 29, 30, something in that range. So, and most other people can deduct it from their federal income tax. So it's not as though, of all the taxes that you could use, in a sense, that's the one that's been used historically, as I said. And I think there was some sentiment in the Senate, even among Republicans, particularly from the southeastern part of the state in the Lehigh Valley, that doing a modest income tax, again, maybe 3.07 to 3.3, was doable last year. This year, undoubtedly, no general income tax.
And I'm going to stop you right there and take another. We have a couple of people holding patiently to get their question in. So let me go to Helge from Murraysville, and then we'll get back to that. Go ahead, please, Helge. And I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah, I have been listening to Professor Strauss making the point that the retirees in Pennsylvania don't pay their fair taxes. And he seems to base this on income, senior income. There is no senior income taxes in Pennsylvania.
Retirement, no tax on retirement income.
Yes, and I agree with that. That is true. But if Professor Strauss should consider taxes on seniors, he should also include real estate taxes, which are considerable in Pennsylvania. I much rather pay income tax than pay tax on
property
my house,
taxes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
which I've been living a lifetime to pay off.
yeah, one of the things that I favor when you're looking at budget problems at the state level, or even the federal, but the state, given that they're supposed to balance their budget, is the notion of a 1 or 2 year emergency surcharge. And second of all, I think that taking away some of the exemptions in the sales tax, keeping the rate the same, makes some sense too.
For instance?
Well,
for instance, we don't pay 6% tax
fees
on clothes.
Right.
We could.
If we have the narrowest sales tax base in the country. I did a calculation a long time ago that if you included clothing, which is roughly proportional to income, by the way, you could increase the revenue from the sales tax by 25–30%.
And it's a consumption tax.
And it's a consumption tax. So if you don't like it, you don't
buy
it.
it.
That's right. So there are lots of ways to think about doing things without necessarily making the rates higher, because rates will have an effect of chasing people across to Delaware, which doesn't have
a sales tax at all.
Right, yeah.
They have a rental tax, an 8% rental tax.
That's right. So it's not as if people and the staff in Harrisburg don't have these ideas. It's just that, as Terry said, people signed a no tax pledge, and it's come back to haunt them. This is an even-numbered year. An emergency surcharge of a couple percent on the income tax, the sales tax, could have made a great difference. But I didn't get any traction on this.
Well, Helge mentioned property taxes, and Governor Wolf also wanted to change the property tax scheme.
Well, he wanted to really get rid of school tax, a good portion of the school taxes. And in my perfect world, and I'm over 65, by the way, if I don't have to pay school taxes and my retirement income is not taxed, I'm not paying for public services. I'm getting a free ride. And I'm forcing the costs of public services onto working couples. And I don't think that's a good idea at the margin.
Yeah, the one big problem with the property tax, it's been estimated that we're talking about $11 to $12 billion to eliminate the property tax. And there's and Republican lawmakers over the last couple of decades have actually put bills in to get rid of the property tax,
right,
which in the polls that I've done is by far the most unpopular tax. The difficulty with that is, in order to make up that revenue, you'd have to raise the income
way up.
And that's right, the income tax and the sales tax to a point that it would be beyond unpopular. And these different taxes produce winners and losers. So depending on where you are on the scheme, in the scheme of things, you're going to have big winners and big losers, and that's going to create other kinds of inequities.
All right. Let's take another call. We've got John who's calling us from Alexandria. Go ahead, please, John.
Yes, my question is about contributions to legislators from the gas industry. Some of those contributions listed on Common Cause, the site, are as high as $101,000 to individual legislators. Others have taken trips with Super Bowl tickets on private planes by the gas industry. Do they have to pay a tax on that activity? And has that contribution influenced their vote, both parties, in terms of whether we should have a severance tax or not?
I'll start with you, Professor Madonna. What's your answer to that?
Well, let's start with this. We have perhaps the weakest campaign finance law in the country and among the weakest lobbying laws. An individual, corporations and unions cannot use corporate money or union dues to make contributions to campaigns. But an individual or a PAC can give any amount of money to any person running for a state office. I don't care, from township supervisor to governor. They can give any amount of money at any time, and the lawmaker can use it for virtually anything. A lawmaker could take his wife, his chief of staff, and his wife to Vegas and use campaign money. And you know why? Because they're strategizing about the election.
Okay.
When it comes to lobbying, a lobbyist, a lawmaker can accept. Now, the Senate has an internal gift rule, but there's no state law. A individual can give a lawmaker any gift he or she wants.
I have a comment.
In any amount of money, as long as it gets reported, and I think the threshold's something like $600. I've been on, this is something that I've written about and talked about extensively, and I go one
So they're
step
buying
further.
Influence, though, Terry Madonna?
Oh, look.
Absolutely.
Most of the time they're giving things to lawmakers whose votes they would probably get anyway. Believe me, I'm not justifying it. But let me just make one quick point. I can mention 40-some, if not 50, lawmakers who have lost their jobs, who have been prosecuted for various kinds of corruption. Not one single legislative ethics committee has reprimanded or censured any lawmaker in modern times. Now imagine that.
And they're getting their pension
operations,
when they retire, when they leave, even under those circumstances. Dr. Strauss.
Well, I think the problem of pay to play and the fact that there's no prohibition on indirect self-dealing is quite accurate and rampant. But if we're going to go round and finger point, some people, cynics, say that one of the reasons that Governor Wolf has been so strong on education is that he got an awful lot of support, and he's reminded daily from the two teachers' unions, and reminded that they love everybody's kids, and that he should support more money without any changes in accountability rules.
All right.
Yeah, but Governor Wolf put $10 million into his campaign. He was at 4 in a poll that I did in the end of January, early February. He put $10 million into his own campaign. He went to 35%. He never trailed in the Democratic primary, in which he won by something like 30 or 40%. He then went on. He never trailed Governor Corbett in any poll, and he went on to win by 9 percentage points. So the fact, or 10 percentage
almost 10,
points.
yeah, 10.
Yeah, the fact of the matter, look, I don't disagree. I don't disagree with the basic point that you're making. But you know, we've got a problem. It's called the First Amendment, as you know, and you get into difficulty when you try to put limitations without public financing. You can't. But the fact of the matter is that we do need some reform, and I'm not a purist on it, but we do need some reform in some of these areas.
All right.
Well, I share your view, but we can't even get budgets passed on time.
That's true.
Right,
Good
and we have
point.
one of the biggest legislatures in the country, and
that's right.
This is lots of talk and pushing to reduce the size of this legislature, and we can't do that, or move our primary, which is April 26th, which almost makes Pennsylvania irrelevant in national politics. We can't change that. But let me go, before you even comment on that, to Phil, who's been patiently waiting in State College. Go ahead, please, Phil.
My question is for Dr. Madonna, and that is regarding the discontent that Donald Trump has raised on a national level and the rather embarrassing impasse we've had on the budget here. Do you have any expectations about what might happen with the legislative elections in this coming year?
Yeah, I don't see much in the way of a big change in the state legislature. We have these large numbers of incumbents who have been put in gerrymandered districts where instead of having 55-45, they're now in 60-40 districts. The biggest challenge they have is a primary. And
they're often uncontested.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I don't see much in the way of now here's the one caveat I would give. Let's say that there's a landslide in our state for one candidate or the other at the presidential election, and we have seen a dramatic increase over the last several elections in straight party voting and a decline in ticket splitting, which our state was infamous for over the past couple of decades. That could move some of the competitive House districts. There are probably only 25 or 30 out of 203 House districts that I would call competitive, and maybe 5 to 7 of the 50 Senate seats. I don't think the House with, I think it's now 118 or 119, there is a vacancy or two, going the other way, and not likely the Senate. I think the legislature will stay the same because of what I call artful and sometimes legal gerrymandering, and the fact that here's the oddity. The lawmakers are actually representing their constituents. That's what we have to remember. In these districts where the voters actually sent these lawmakers to vote for no tax hikes, fewer government regulations, and reduce the footprint of state government. So the voters are getting what they voted for. Statewide, the picture was different with the election of Wolf. The real problem might be with Senator Toomey in a wave election that goes, let's say hypothetically, I'm not predicting this, would go with the Democrats. That Toomey would, I think, be more vulnerable if that's the case.
Okay, I want to quickly take this back for a minute to going forward, the next budget negotiation, and from where you're sitting, Dr. Roush, you're in this. Well,
that's what I was thinking about. I've got some great advice here, and I'm thinking, as one of those people who represents those who get collateral damage.
Right.
Where is it going to go from here? And I want to emphasize that a lot of people think of the college in the media. The discussion was all about extension and agriculture and so forth. But in fact, we serve people. Most of the people we serve these days are not mainstream agriculture. There's about 33,000 farms. We've got 92,000 members of 4-H. Most of those kids will never go into agriculture, but they go into science. They go, they're twice likely to go into science, into university. They study lots of other things. They become very active citizens. We train something like 70,000 child care people in a program called Better Kid Care. About 11,000 people in something we call Prosper, which is to help manage drug abuse among the young. So there's all kinds of other people we serve. So it's not actually just about our college or extension. The people that are collateral damage are all over the state in every county, and most of them are in agriculture. And I guess I'm left wondering, what the heck can we do to make sure that engine drivers like the university or college and extension, which are actually generating probably benefits far beyond the sort of money that goes into them. What do we do to try to make sure we don't, in this process, do a lot of collateral damage to the state that's far more costly than it might seem?
Yeah, and I don't know if anyone has an answer for you, but one of the things you said that I thought was just so to the point is that if you were shuttered, how could you possibly restart something as enormous as, the cost of something like that, it's untenable.
I think what a lot of people didn't realize, I think for a long time some people thought we were bluffing, that President Barron was bluffing, and he said we're going to have to lay off 1,100 people.
And 350 of them from Center County. The impact in this county would have been enormous.
Huge. So how do you shutter? This is not. These people are highly specialized. Some of the damage that has been done to the college and the people we serve include that big threats to the state include avian flu to the poultry industry. Because of the outbreaks in the Midwest, those people are in very high demand. We were stopped from recruiting at a critical time where we'd want to bring more people in. New federal food safety legislation. All states are going to have to adopt to this. People who can help translate that information to small and medium processors and farmers, research and so forth. extremely high demand around the country. We were basically standing still for 9 months.
Let me stop you there because we have less than 2 minutes, so I'd like you in 30 seconds each to just say, where do we go from here? How do we make this process, how do we help this legislature and this governor have a productive budget negotiation? I'll begin with you, Dr. Roush, Dr. Strauss.
I think institutionally and individually, higher education folks have to begin to speak out and talk to their representatives and senators. And also the governor needs to understand that he can't hold education hostage, either K through 12 or higher ed. It's not a game that wins votes, and it's not a game good for anybody. And we have to be very vocal about that.
And we're going to continue. We'll continue doing that because I realized that we didn't win any kind of a battle here. That we survived one, and we've been caught up in a war that we had nothing to do with. So we'll have to keep getting our message out as well.
All right, Dr. Madonna, just a couple of seconds.
Yeah, I'm the eternal optimist, but I must tell you, given the hardened positions that each side has taken, I'm not very optimistic that much is going to be done. I think we're going to limp along without any major changes in the budget. They may end up doing pretty much what they've done now through the election cycle anyway. I don't see much in the way of...
Do you expect it on July 1st?
I doubt that. I mean, that would be...
A miracle?
Okay. That would be unusual given the hardened positions that each side has.
We have to leave it there. I'd like to thank all of our guests tonight. Robert Strauss, Professor of Economics and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. Richard Roush, Dean of the College of Agricultural Sciences at Penn State. And Terry Madonna, Director of the Center for Politics and Public Affairs at Franklin and Marshall College. I'm Patty Satalia. For all of us here at WPSU, thanks for joining us. Have a good night.